So the leaves are now making a mess in front of my yard, which either indicates a toxic level of radiation buildup in my neighborhood, or that we've entered the season of fall. That's right, we've entered the months of pumpkin spice lattes, sweaters over shirts, and grueling back-to-school traffic. And with Halloween just around the corner, I figure I'd dedicate the next couple of videos to the month of spooky season. In fact, one sec. There we go. Where I'm going to talk about all things I find frightening. And this week, we're going to be going over that horrifying period of time when DC was trying to reinvent one of their flagship heroes, that being Superman. Yeah, for a number of years, whenever you brought up the character of the Man of Tomorrow, a common response you'd be presented with is, Superman? He's like boring and lame. It'd be way cooler if he was like evil. Instead of producing the logical response, which is, isn't that already something that's kind of been done? You are instead met with a bunch of enthusiastic cheers and eager producers looking to cash in on this growing popular trend. If anything I'm saying is ringing a bell, then you probably recall that time that the Superman, but evil, trope was on the rise. Yeah, between the years of about 2010 to 2019, I noticed something of a spike in depictions of the daring do-gooder being looked through a more cynical lens. And along with this spike was the rolling out of various adaptations and a few original ideas using this template as a baseline, becoming so popular that even the Man of Tomorrow himself would go from looking like a benevolent stranger from another world to something more akin to a demigod whose kindness is not something to be taken for granted. But why did this period of time produce so many stories in this mold? What is so appealing about this type of tale? And is it something we're still seeing to this day? Well, that's something I'm looking to find out. So, let's discuss. Oh yeah, we're busting out the creepy intro and everything for this one. So last go around we talked about a popular trope in fiction, which is defined by taking the character of Superman and creating a variant who, rather than having his moral altruistic values, instead takes a more sinister, dark turn. And after sitting on it for a bit, I've decided that I'm gonna name this trope Superman, but evil. Characterized by having similar abilities and reputation as Superman, being one of the central figures of their universe. And what makes them different from a down-and-out villain is that their more sinister nature is kept under wraps through either a series of lies and gaslighting, going so far as to even sometimes hide it from the audience. Basically, unlike normal evil doppelgangers, their villainous nature is supposed to be a twist, and not just given right out the gate. But we've already gone over where this trope originated from, and now I want to look into its rise to popularity during the mid-2010s, and the numerous adaptations it saw, and influence it had over fiction as a whole. And the first place we should look is in the character that this whole trope is inspired by. In September of 2011, following the events of the seminal comic Flashpoint Paradox, DC would see a major reboot for its entire universe, launching a brand new line of number ones, each comic under the banner, New 52. This New 52 rollout would be done in an effort in order to modernize many of its most popular characters, including but not limited to, Superman. And some of the main changes that he would undergo would be indicative of the rise of this more cynical outlook on superheroes. The first noticeable change you'll see is that he's missing kind of a centerpiece of his costume. That's right, the trunks. I'm actually working on a discussion all on its own on this particular piece of Superman's iconography, but to be brief, following its removal, its signal revealed that they were trying to take this character who, for the longest time, had been kind of a hokey Boy Scout, and give him a bit of edge to his personality, making him less silly and goofy, and more macho and serious. And for a time, his adaptations would follow this approach, most notably in the 2013 release of Man of Steel, the first official reboot in the Superman film franchise. And unlike those previous installments inspired by the more classic runs, this Superman would take inspiration from things like Superman Earth 1, John Byrne's Man of Steel, including taking the name, and of course the New 52. And we'll circle back to this movie in a sec because, while it did have a degree of an impact on how Superman would be portrayed moving forward, it was more so the sequels to the story, and not so much this film itself. Also, it was generally met with mixed opinions, rather than the wave of enthusiastic acceptance that this next project would receive. And this was none other than the video game Injustice: Gods Among Us. Yeah, in 2013, we really got the 1-2 punch of Superman with a darker spin on him. Man of Steel making him a bit more dour and cynical, and portraying him less as a beacon of hope in a world of darkness, and more like a conflicted outsider trying to figure out whether or not this world is even worth protecting. Meanwhile, on the video game side of things, they just cut to the chase and made this guy a flat-out antagonist, centering the idea around what if Joker had decided to go to Metropolis and piss off old Big Blue? And I'm not just talking about something benign like a pie to the face or watching his entire video and not leaving him a like, comment, and subscribing, though those are both pretty bad things, but more like tricking him to kill his wife and unborn child in a drug-induced frenzy while also adding insult to injury and blowing up the city of Metropolis. Yeah, and I bet you thought you had a bad day at work today. This disastrous one bad day situation results in Superman being pushed to his breaking point, causing him to confront the Joker in custody and putting an end once and for all to the Clown Prince of Crime, taking his first steps into what would be his new world order. And as I said, this story would have a much warmer reception than any of the films with the same characters, mainly down to the fact that it's a video game, so the story itself isn't the only thing it's judged upon, and as a fighting game, or at least what I'm told, it was at the time one of the best in the market. And because it was technically an Elseworld story, going as far as to bring in multiple versions of the same characters to fight one another, it wasn't really seen as a desecration of any of the characters, namely down to the fact that it was already set up to be a conflict against evil doppelgangers. Similar to what we've seen in things before like the Justice Lords coming to the mainline universe in the Justice League cartoon, or storylines dealing with things like Earth 3 and the Crime Syndicate. Though, because I think it was exposing a whole different audience to these corners of the DC universe, and concepts like a Superman going bad, do I think that a brand new swath of players who were otherwise unfamiliar with these characters and their stories began thinking, yeah, that's actually a pretty cool idea. What if Superman was evil? Allowing this trend to really kick up into high gear. And funny enough, 2013 would also see the release of one of the most famous Batman storylines getting an animated adaptation in the form of The Dark Knight Returns, which itself featured a morally conflicted Superman coming to blows with that universe's Batman, further instilling in the public zeitgeist the idea that Superman could be turned against his allies, and in that scenario, how would one go about taking him down? And this, more so the graphic novel was based on, would heavily inspire the next installment in the DCEU, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. Once again putting Superman in an antagonistic role, pinned up against the Caped Crusader, in a David vs. Goliath style showdown. Pair this along with that grim outlook that this director is known for injecting into his films, and you've not only cemented in the minds of many fans that Superman was not to be trusted, but also convinced a ton of people that the DC universe as a whole was simply just a dark counterpart to what the folks over at Marvel were doing. And with the only popular DC films around this era being the Dark Knight trilogy and the Zack Snyder films, well, it pretty much locked DC into this more grim interpretation of their comic book universe. And this, I think, had a knock-on effect, causing more people to be interested in an evil version of Superman, and thus the rise of the Superman but he's evil trope. And only 2 years after the release of Batman v Superman, Warner Bros. Would suffer yet another crushing defeat with the release of Justice League, absolutely bombing in terms of its critical reception. And while all this was going on, we began to see the rise of the Superman but evil counterparts. Up to this point, the cynical, darker take on superheroes and the powers themselves was in high gear. Stories like Hancock, Megamind, and my personal favorite, Chronicle, would call into question the very people bestowed with these amazing gifts, and challenge their audiences by posing the possibility that perhaps these so-called super individuals weren't necessarily going to turn out to be heroes in the traditional sense, or in any sense at all. And this, paired up along with stories like Kick-Ass and Super, shows that even those who choose to pick up the costume and start trying to help their community might not be doing as much good as they intend. Hell, one of these films that came out would be adapting the very story that started this introspection into the superhero, that being Watchmen, also directed by Zack Snyder, funny enough. And after the release of Deadpool in 2016, the floodgates were open for making more and more R-rated superhero projects. And this would culminate in the year 2019 with the release of both The Boys and Brightburn. Two stories that would directly homage Superman and, for the most part, the DC universe. But with the twist that every one of these superpowered individuals would be anything but heroic. Between the two of them, I will say that The Boys is a far better told story, mainly just down to the fact that Brightburn isn't as interested in exploring what causes someone to act out like this, instead just going with the lazy answer of, oh, it's some brainwashing from an alien planet. Meanwhile, The Boys is much more interested in its characters, diving deep into what makes them tick, and the corrupting effect of too much power in the wrong hands. With its character of Homelander being a staple of the medium, and one of the most successful translations of character to screen ever attempted. And Amazon would manage to capture lightning in a bottle twice with the release of Invincible. Taking on a similar story with the character of Omni-Man, Once again, another so-called hero with the powers of Superman, as well as his standing within the community he's a part of, taking a dark turn, but now instead of it being an entirely cynical world of so-called superheroes just out for themselves, instead it is an honest and true superhero universe where the rule isn't power corrupts, but instead it reveals. And unlike the characters in The Boys, the people of Earth actually stand a fighting chance against the antagonistic force bearing down on them. But while it seems like everyone and their mother was taking the piss out of the idea of a benevolent savior coming down from on high to help usher humanity to a brighter tomorrow, the folks over at DC who, actually had to take this seriously, need to rediscover what it meant to tell a Superman story in the modern day. They already started by allowing a lot more of their movies and television shows to lighten things up a bit and be more willing to have fun with the source material. And by the year 2020, it seems that they came to the decision that when it comes to adapting Superman, just give us Superman. But not like that. The transition had already begun during the DC Rebirth era, where it seemed like a lot of the elements from before the New 52 were being reintroduced in this sort of universe-colliding merger. And one of the biggest decisions the company ended up going with was bringing back the post-crisis Superman from between the 80s and early 2000s, as well as killing the New 52 Superman and having the classic one take his place, now just as a married man with his wife Lois and son Jonathan. So no more weird Wonder Woman hookups. And a few years later, the adaptations would follow, starting with the versions of him that have been alluded to but never quite seen in the live-action Supergirl series, finally being given a face, which belonged to none other than Teen Wolf star Tyler Hoechlin. And Hoechlin would play this character very different from his big screen counterpart, straying away from the gloomy, disconnected nature of Henry Cavill's Superman, and being more of a smiley, hopeful friend to humanity. We'd also be given an animated movie starring the Big Blue Boy Scout, in the form of Superman Man of Tomorrow, which brought back the trunks and hopeful nature of the character for what was looking to be a burgeoning new animated universe. That extended universe didn't quite work out, but the movie itself was pretty solid. And in 2021, Tyler Hoechlin's Superman would even be given his own series titled Superman and Lois, where even though it was a bit more of a serious drama, it still maintained the character of Superman and his never-ending optimism and love for the people of Earth. He'd also finally be given another animated series in the form of My Adventures with Superman, which you can imagine continued the trend of being more bright and friendly, along with good for all ages. And honestly, moving forward, you really wouldn't see Superman being anything other than the good-hearted farm boy from Kansas in any other medium. Well, except for that Suicide Squad Kills the Justice League game, but that thing was stuck in development hell for 9 years, so it was kind of a carryover from this increasingly irrelevant era. There was also that Injustice movie, but that thing kind of felt already a half-decade too late. Basically, Superman was just leading the charge in terms of DC climbing out of this dark, grim hole that it dug itself in. And nowadays, you really don't see a lot of examples of Superman but evil, beyond the ones that already existed during this trend's heyday. Hell, when Netflix tried to cash in on this trend, it was already a little bit too late, with its series Jupiter's Legacy, which crashed and burned harder than that time I tried to talk about Scott Pilgrim when no one was interested. Though I blame Jupiter's Legacy's failure more so in the subpar writing, and less that it was trying to cash in on a trope that was already past its prime. Which honestly to me just kind of confirms that this was more or less just a phase, with an ever-growing sense of cynicism amongst general audiences. But it seems like after that year that we don't talk about anymore, people all around the world are just sick and tired of everything being doom and gloom. Because I think for a lot of us, we've already gotten our fill of we can't trust the people in power who are tasked with protecting us, to last an entire lifetime that maybe it'd be nice to dream of a world where, yeah, these people who do hold a substantial amount of power actually plan to do some good with it. Wouldn't that be nice? Oh, I'm Because that's kind of the appeal of the Superman but evil trope. Questioning figures and individuals whose kindness and positive contributions to the world were taken as a given, as well as it for a time being exciting to see such a taboo concept of superheroes being just flat out bad, giving into the temptations that a bunch of us have, as well as some of the ones I hope none of you have, and acting out in a manner that would be horrifying to witness in real life, but exciting through the medium of film and television. But eventually started coming at the cost of seeing these characters get a genuine translation from the pages to the screen, that it kinda soured the whole naughty superhero concept. And now it seems what people crave more than ever are characters demonstrating genuine humanity and a level of depth that can't be explored through such cynical lenses. It's why I think people were so enthusiastic for that new Superman movie, which in my opinion captured the heart and soul of the character as he's been depicted for so many years. So to wrap things up, it does feel like we are at the end of an era where shock value and gory action are no longer the selling points that they once were.
That was so up, you guys.
And maybe that's okay. You know, sure, now I can watch a train full of people get splattered to death by my protagonist and not bat an eye, but you know what? Maybe that allows me to look past all the blood and gore and analyze the story for what it is, and that could be a pretty good thing. Because the stories that are still sticking around now have to rely on their good writing and well-developed characters, and not just the initial sales pitch of Superman, but, you know, you get the idea. And since it doesn't look like we're going to be seeing an end to any of these superhero stories in the near future, I am excited to see more creativity injected into how these guys are portrayed. I mean, hell, I even bent my one rule to not watch a season until it was all finished by tuning into the first episode of Season 2 of Peacemaker. And I gotta say, a mid-size orgy is certainly a hell of a way to kick off your new universe. Marvel would never.